¿Por qué no puedes parar de ver cosas? O sea, me lo voy a ver solo si está traducido. Fuck. Puta madre, toqué todo, menos lo que tenía que tocar. No, subtítulos. Pss, traducir al español. Nada, es que es muy largo para verlo con una traducción errónea. Igual habla muy claro, si va a traducir bien. Notice, I don't know to know me. Decime que te gusta el asado, Oscu, obvio. Aguante la carne. La carne es todo lo que está bien. Oscu se dice igual que hace 6 años. Me alegro, amigo. Bienvenido a otro video de Oscurlot. No sé si quería traducirlo a todos los idiomas.
Our dopamine circuitry is like a big lemon that's full of juice. We can do a very pleasurable activity, and that's like squeezing the lemon really hard, right? Or we can do a very boring activity, so it's like a slight squeeze. When I wake up in the morning and my dopamine circuitry is full of dopamine, even a slight squeeze will give us a fair amount of juice, right? When the lemon is full, I can squeeze it a little bit, I get a decent amount of juice. The problem is that if I squeeze it really hard when I first wake up in the morning, all of the juice runs out. So there's this weird...
¿Y cada cuánto se recargan los niveles de dopamina? Porque es interesante esto que dice. Le voy a preguntar a ChatGPT. Porque sí, nunca sintieron que se despertaron a la mañana y vieron las redes sociales que liberan mucha dopamina, tipo TikTok, Facebook, esto, lo otro, y terminaron muy cansados. ¿Y cuándo se regenera eso? ¿Cuándo se vuelve a llenar, vamos a preguntarle así nomás, la dopamina del cerebro? ¿O cuánto tarda en restablecerse? No banco ese video, mirá la cara del viajando de ese. No, amigo, yo lo veo mucho este. Es un médico de Estados Unidos, no sé si nació en India, algo así. Pero lo veo hace mucho. Why your brain fog never goes away. Perdón, no le estaba mostrando la pantalla. Pero bueno. Doctor K, how do I focus? No sé cuánto. Why you physically exhausted all the time. Ok. Habla cada tanto de las cosas, pero es un capo este. A ver, la dopamina es un neurotransmisor clave en la regulación del placer. La recompensa, la motivación se produce de manera continua en el cerebro, pero los niveles fluctúan según diversas actividades y estímulos. Después que se libera dopamina, el cerebro comienza a restablecer sus niveles, lo cual puede variar variar en función de factores como la actividad física, la alimentación, el sueño y el estado emocional. Algunos factores a considerar: liberación aguda, consumo de sustancias, dependencia del abuso, estilo de vida saludable. Está bien, pero suponiendo que me levanto con todas las reservas de dopamina, veo muchos TikToks y agoto mis reservas, ¿cuánto demoran en restablecerse? ¿Unas horas? ¿Al otro día? Pero mostrame que estás escribiendo, Oscar. No, yo no muestro mi chat GPT. Le pregunto demasiadas cosas. Pensé que era la única que hablaba así al chat GPT. No, es que está bueno, le puedes hablar de la forma que te cante el orto y te lo interpreta bien. Si consumes contenido en TikTok u otras actividades que estimulan rápidamente la liberación de dopamina como las redes sociales, lo que está experimentando no es tanto un agotamiento de dopamina literal, sino una desensibilización temporal de los receptores de dopamina en el cerebro. Eso significa que con tanta estimulación rápida y constante el cerebro empieza a responder menos a la dopamina y a necesitar más estímulos para obtener una sensación de placer. En este contexto, si te saturas de dopamina viendo muchos TikToks, recuperación inmediata. Los niveles de dopamina en el cerebro suelen volver a la normalidad en unas cuantas horas, pero depende de cuánto te sobrecargues con este tipo de estímulos. Ver vídeos rápidos y repetitivos activa la dopamina en ráfagas cortas y frecuentes, pero no causa un agotamiento profundo como lo haría una droga. Al día siguiente, si descansas adecuadamente, es muy probable que para el día siguiente ya te sientas restablecido en cuanto a la sensibilidad de los receptores de dopamina. Un buen descanso nocturno es clave para reiniciar el sistema. Bueno, listo. Suficiente información. Vamos a ver lo que dice el doctor Droguis. No sin antes ver qué vamos a comer hoy. ¿Qué pido? Algo rápido, sin muchas vueltas. Es que solamente se puede elegir pollo, carne o un poco de salmón. Y me podría pedir un wrap de pollo. Banco. Es una buena elección. Sí, me voy a pedir un wrap de pollo de Green Eat. Wrap de pollo. Y para tener un poco más de proteína, me voy a pedir un poquito nada más. Un hummus con zanahorias, que está bastante bueno. Listo, pedir. Uy, esto para que hay unos pedidos acá abajo que me llaman la atención. No son otros restaurantes. Tengo la garganta re picosa. Pam, 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 pam. Ok, me lo pido. Pedir, dame un segundo. ¿Qué vas a pedir? Un wrap de pollo. Es decir, va a venir un pollo rapeando. Ok. Yo tengo mucha proteína. Heroína es lo que yo no consumo porque esto es... Bien, ¿cuál ha sido tu viaje favorito? No sé si al Mundial de Fortnite de Nueva York o a Madrid cuando fui que me invitó Heretics la primera vez. Esos dos viajes fueron muy buenos. Creo que esos dos, creo. No estoy seguro de lo que digo. Un viaje a Punta del Este también que hice en 2021 que me encantó. Fueron las vacaciones que me tomé, las primeras vacaciones que me tomé desde que empecé en stream. 100% vacaciones, digamos, que no fue por viaje que me invitaron a ningún lado, sino que me fui a Punta del Este a disfrutar la vida. Y Fueron unas vacaciones increíbles, la pasé muy bien. Fuimos con Luke y de todo ese viaje, te diría, salió el vibe y las ganas de ser número uno. O sea, finales de 2021, principio de 2022. Bueno, ahí pedí la comida. Bueno, vamos. Vamos a hacer esto rápidamente. ¿Te fíjate el permatrago? O sea, tendría que preguntar qué es, ¿no? Para que sea, ¿qué es? Vamos.
Stuff on the internet.
Quiero ver esto rápido porque dura 30 minutos, no lo voy a ver todo. Simplemente quiero ver el principio porque me parece interesante. ¿Esto lo hará en stream o lo charla?
Hard when I first wake up in the morning, all of the juice runs out. So there's this weird stuff on the internet that kind of rots our brain. This stuff like
Deme un segundo, perdón. Quiero ver si no estaba en velocidad acelerada por el directo.
decent amount of
Ok,
juice.
vamos.
The problem is that if I squeeze it really hard when I first wake up in the morning, all of the juice runs out. So there's this weird stuff on the internet that kind of rots our brain. This stuff like Skibbity Toilet. I don't even know what that is. Like, I don't know if it's like a song or a dance move or a picture or a philosophy or religion. I don't even know what Skibbity Toilet is. And the problem is that the internet is getting filled with this kind of stuff. And we spend our times engaging with this stuff that like isn't a narrative, it's not a story, it's not a game. We just spend our time on the internet doing this weird crap. But the weirder thing is not just that we do it, it's that we can't stop. So today we're going to teach y'all a little bit about what the hell is going on, and also hopefully give y'all a foundation to spend less time rotting your brain. So the first thing is that the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is going to be like really fundamental stuff. We're going to be going to biological basics. And I know that that may sound a little bit weird, but I think it's becoming increasingly important for you to understand how your brain actually works. Like, what is it for? Like, why do we have these organs called brains? Once we understand that, we'll understand what is going on with all of this weird content on the internet, which, by the way, is like a weird thing to call it, right? It's not a story, it's not a game, it's not a movie, it's content. It's some weird, lifeless, amorphous pile of whatever that is not like anywhere near an art form. So we have to understand what's going on in our brain, how this content is affecting our brain, and hopefully that will...
¿Qué estamos viendo? ¿Por qué no puedes parar de ver cualquier contenido en las redes sociales? Me gustó el concepto que acaba de tirar de esta bola rara que consumimos, que no es arte, es contenido. Me da placer lo bien que habla, a mí también. Y lo que está bueno es que el traductor lo traduce muy bien y que si dejo de leer y le presto atención seguramente lo entiendo. Porque cuando hablan así de claro lo entiendo bastante el inglés. La verdad me sorprendió el video, muy interesante, fuera de joda. Este chabón es un capo, amigo. Y este video en particular me llamó mucho la atención, por eso me lo guardé en ver más tarde. Bueno, sigamos. Hay que estar muy concentrado, amigo. O sea, hay que constantemente leer y se llega a leer justo casi. Así que cualquier momento que me pare a leer el chat me saca de eje. Así que nada, voy a estar callado hablando y cuando tenga algo que decir lo pauso. O sea, callado escuchándolo. Uy, ¿qué pasó? ¿Qué? ¿Ya llegó a mi casa el pedido? No puede ser. Bro, lo pedí hace 3 minutos. Está el chabón afuera. Bueno, ahí vengo. ¿Me bancan? Igual está a un par de cuadras nada más, pero ¿qué? ¿Cómo puede ser, amigo? Sí, está afuera. Ahí vengo. Y voy a comer mientras lo leo. Amigo, ya me parecía extraño que el chabón haya venido tan rápido. O sea, lo pedí a los 2 minutos. Se equivocó. Tipo, en vez de ir al restaurante, vino a mi casa primero. Pero está acá un par de cuadras, así que va, lo retira y ahora vuelven con el pedido. Ya decía, amigo, o sea, lo pedí, puse el celu, hablé 2 minutos con ustedes y me tocaron el timbre. Y dije, ¿qué acaba de pasar? Fui a abrirle y estaba el chabón sin nada en la mano. Y yo dije, me robaron. ¿Qué está pasando acá? Le abrí y me hizo, perdón, me confundí. Bueno, vamos, vemos el videito. Igual ahora ya en 5 minutos me vuelven a tocar el timbre. Pero esta vez no me avisa rápido, me va a tocar el timbre directamente. Así que, nada, voy a tener que escuchar. Bueno, let's go. Bueno, contenido de redes sociales, Skibbity Toilet y demás. Dale propina por la pateada que se pegó.
Lay the foundation for us to understand content is affecting our brain, and hopefully that will lay the foundation for us to understand how to actually get over it. So, we're going to start with like really basic stuff, okay? Which is like, why do human beings...
Debe ser la aplicación de Rappi. Hola, tu Rappi te necesita. Hola, tu Rappi. Sí, la concha de tu madre que me va a necesitar. Yo necesito mi Rappi. Se te fue la aplicación de garganta, sí, un poco. Tenía un trabajo yo a la comida.
We're going to start with foundation for us to understand how to actually get over it. So, we're going to start with like really basic stuff, okay? Which is like, why do human beings have brains? So we have brains to help us survive. And the circuitry in our brain is designed to move us towards staying alive, right? And a lot of the stuff that we have in our brains is kind of designed for that reason. So a simple example is orgasm. So why do human beings, or animals for that matter, why are they capable of orgasm? Why did we evolve this kind of particular circuit
Para
so
que
that
nos
we can
reproduzcamos.
experience this maximal pleasure? It's because for the survival of the human race, we require sexual relations. And so without this fundamental thing, the human race would die out. Therefore, from an evolutionary standpoint, we develop this thing that gives us immense pleasure. Arguably, the most immense pleasure that you can get from life is orgasm. So we're going to say, like, okay, this thing is really important for us. Therefore, we are going to maximize the pleasure circuitry around it to induce the right kind of behavior.
Gracias, Skyfi, por el Supreme. Te mando un saludo muy grande.
Maximize the pleasure circuitry around it to induce the right kind of behavior. And it's not just orgasm. So this is also why, for example, we've developed social relationships. When you hug someone, or when you receive a hug, you get this spurt of oxytocin. Oxytocin improves your anxiety, improves your mood, helps you form bonds, relaxes you a little bit, lowers your stress level. And why is that? It's because when human beings hug each other, it forms a bond with them, and this sort of helps them increase their survival chances. Okay, so this is the thing. The brain is all designed to help us survive. Even the negative things that we experience, like hunger and thirst, why are they negative? It's because the brain is sending us a signal, hey, this thing is against our survival. This thing, unless we fix this problem, we will die, like drinking water. Therefore, I'm going to make this experience of dehydration unpleasant. So our brain wants to reward particular experiences that improve survival and punish us for particular experiences that decrease survival. Simple enough, right? Now, here's the problem. A bunch of people out there have figured out how to, in isolated ways, activate some of these circuits in our brain without actually providing us with the full benefit of what that circuit is for. Now, I recognize that that sentence was kind of long, so I'll give you a simple analogy, right? So there's a difference between calories and nutrition, right?
Ahí está mi brother del Rappi. Ahí vengo. Bueno, ahora sí, amigos. Bajo, agarro la comida, subo, como y vemos el video. Bien, amigos. Fue a buscar la comida y lo mandaron a repartir. Perdón la tardanza, amigos. Nada. Me armé la mierda esta. Me vino re chiquito el Rappi. O sea, es más chiquito de lo que parece. Qué sé yo. Bueno, ahora esta basura. ¿Qué tan factible será comer mientras leo? A ver, vamos a probarlo. Si lo veo que se me complica mucho para después, pongo un video en español. Pero vamos a verlo. Bueno, me pedí un wrap de pollo y un hummus con zanahorias. ¿Por qué? Porque puedo. Bueno, a ver.
So one of them is, sure, it's like energy and fuel. It's a partial, right? So one of them is, sure, it's like energy and fuel. It's a partial way to stay alive, right? We can eat calories, just plain calories. We can eat like a candy bar or a Twinkie, but that's very different from broccoli. Now, our taste buds and our GI system and even our brain has started to send rewarding signals to us when we eat calorically dense food because it sort of correlates with survival. So someone came along and is like, hey, I have a great idea. Let's make a candy bar. And with a candy bar, what we're going to get is a maximum activation of this particular circuit of the brain. But we're not going to include any nutrition in it, right? So what happens if you eat candy bars all day? You'll get a bunch of calories and you'll get arguably a bunch of pleasure, but you won't get the full, complete experience of nutrition. If you eat a bunch of candy bars, you'll develop obesity, you'll develop insulin resistance. Our dopamine circuitry is like a big...
Nah, amigo, toqué el control y se puso desde el principio. ¿En serio pasa eso?
Becoming the biological basics, and I know about today is going to be like
¿Cómo mierda pasó
really
eso?
Fundamental stuff. We're going to be going to biological basics, and I know that that understand how your brain actually works. Like, what is it for? Understand what is going on with all of this weird content on the internet, which, by the way, is like a weird thing to call it, right? It's not a
Concha de madre, cambié el color del teclado, nada que ver. Vida de mierda. Bueno, a ver, vamos a ver.
decrease survival. Simple enough, right? You'll develop obesity, you'll develop particular circuit of the brain. Brain has started to send rewarding
Por acá, ¿no?
energy and fuel. It's a partial way to stay alive, right? We can eat to, in isolated ways, activate some full benefit of what that circuit is for. Now, I recognize that that sentence was kind of long, so I'll give you a simple benefit of what in our brain with between calorie fuel. It's
Okay,
a partial way to stay alive, right? We can eat calories, just plain calories, or we can eat like a candy. Taste buds and our GI system and even our brain has started to send rewarding signals to us when we eat calorically dense food because it sort of correlates with survival. So someone came along and is like, hey, I have a great idea. Let's make a candy bar. And with a candy bar, what we're going to get is a maximum activation of this particular circuit of the brain. But we're not going to include any nutrition in it, right? So what happens if you eat candy bars all day? You'll get a bunch of calories and you'll get arguably a bunch of pleasure, but you won't get the full, complete experience of nutrition. If you eat a bunch of candy bars, you'll develop obesity, you'll develop insulin resistance, you'll develop vascular complications, you'll literally develop things like numbness in your fingertips and toes, which results in like wound healing problems and all of these kinds of problems.
¿Cómo funciona eso? A mí me ha pasado cuando, no sé si estoy flasheando, perdón, no sé si estoy flasheando, tipo como, ¿cómo se llama cuando sos psicosomático? Que pienso que me pasa, pero yo había escuchado que los que tienen diabetes sienten como entumecimientos en los dedos, ¿viste? Como que después se los terminan cortando incluso. Y a mí me ha pasado veces que he comido mucho azúcar durante el día, que sentí como un pinchazón, una electrificación leve en los dedos, ¿viste? En la punta de los dedos. Y hasta lo busqué y todo para saber qué era. Más o menos que me saqué las dudas, pero ¿se referirá a eso cuando está hablando de esto? O sea, yo cuando me pasó dije, ¿será por haber comido mucho azúcar? Pero a ver, ¿qué dice exactamente?
Develop obesity, you'll develop insulin resistance, you'll develop vascular complications, you'll literally develop things like numbness in your fingertips and toes, which results in like wound healing problems and all of these kinds of problems.
O sea, el entumecimiento en los dedos son problemas de cicatrización. O no sé si estoy mezclando las dos cosas. Me pasa igual. Es que sí, no sé si tendrá que ver con eso o es eso, es psicosomatía, pero bueno.
So this is the key thing that we also need to understand about these circuits and when we inappropriately activate them. Anytime you inappropriately or artificially activate a circuit, it causes problems in the human body. And today what we're going to do is go over a couple of examples of those and really sort of highlight why brain rot is so devastating and so addictive. Hey y'all, if you're interested in applying some of the principles that we discussed to your life to actually create change, check out Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. The guide synthesized my years of training as a monk along with years of clinical experience as a psychiatrist to cover common topics like meditation, ADHD, and trauma. The guides include over or YouTube store with our free review, which are also linked below. So definitely check them out. So another good example of like when we artificially activate things is actually medication. So I can give you a medicine for lowering your blood pressure, and that's on balance a good thing. But as I'm sure y'all know, what comes with medicine? Side effects. And this is exactly what we see with all of these brain rot kind of things, right? When I eat just candy bars, when I take medication, when I watch pornography, it activates my body or brain in a isolated way instead of a complete way. We're getting calories instead of nutrition, and therefore that causes problems. So what are the big problems that are caused by brain rot? The biggest problem with calories instead of nutrition is that it destroys our hunger. So remember, hunger is used to help us survive. So when I fill up on candy bars, I no longer feel hungry. This is the driving force for like health and survival and arguably happiness. And what's going on the internet is we have a bunch of people who are experimenting with stuff, right? And this is the problem with the internet is that like the most brain rotting stuff is what rises to the top because we have this Darwinian experience of, okay, there's like a bazillion TikToks out there or YouTube shorts or whatever, right? Instagram reels or we're being platform agnostic, okay? We have 1,000 of these things. And which one do you see? You see the one that rots your brain the most because this content is the stuff that activates certain parts of your brain. So there's certain content that will be funny, but will also like activate your empathic circuitry and will also help make you feel like pity for someone else, and it engages you in lots of ways. We also know that there's stuff like rage bait, right? And when we watch rage bait, what we see is increases in heart rate, we see increases in blood pressure, but when we see increases in heart rate and blood pressure without things like physical exercise, that actually
Quiero ver qué es eso. El Rage Bait, que es un programa de televisión de peleas. Tiene pinta.
increases in heart rate and blood pressure. Without, we see increases in blood pressure. But when we see increases in heart, we see is increases.
Rage Bait. Mal momento para comer chocolates. ¿Qué es el rage bait utilizado por influencers? Para generar tracción a través de la ira y sentimientos negativos. ¡A la mierda! O sea, claro, clickbait de rague. O sea, los creadores polémicos que buscan tu odio, como por ejemplo el Mexivergas, ¿no? Estamos hablando. Tipo, generar interacciones por más que sean negativas. Ok. Un segundo. Un segundito, buscando algo. Ya volvemos a la programación habitual. Ok. Bueno, sigamos viendo este video. A ver. No, en realidad se recuperó, jaja, yo lo sigo por Instagram, está más maduro. Está en otro viaje personal. Bueno, a ver. Shit, 6 años y 3 meses. Gracias, brother. Un abrazo.
In heart rate, we see increases in blood pressure, but when we see increases in heart rate and
Vamos a
blood
probar
pressure without things like physical
uno como
exercise,
físico.
that actually damages our body, and we'll show you a couple papers about that later. So this is the basic problem with the brain rotting stuff, right? So first of all, there's this Darwinian evolution
No, comer y hacer eso es mucho tiempo.
that actually damages our body, and we'll show you a couple papers about that later. So this is the basic problem with the brain rotting stuff, right? So first of all, there's this Darwinian evolutionary kind of selection for the most brain rotting stuff, and the most brain rotting stuff actually activates a number of different circuits, but only partially. And once we start to activate these circuits in a partial way, the biggest problem is that once we activate the circuit, the drive to actually do something healthy disappears. When I eat a candy bar, I no longer want to eat broccoli. So let's run through a couple of simple examples of why this stuff is so unhealthy for us. So everyone knows that dopamine is kind of like this pleasure chemical. We have this part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which anytime we do something pleasurable, it releases a spurt of dopamine. Now we have a really good video about, we've got a couple of good videos about dopamine. Y'all can definitely check those out, but I'm going to kind of give y'all a quick rundown of one of the really important points here. So when we wake up in the morning, our dopamine circuitry is like a fresh lemon, okay? So big lemon that's full of juice. Now there are two kinds
Ok, lo que dijo al principio que era eso del limón era esto, pero lo adelantábamos.
of activities that we can do. We can do a very pleasurable activity like playing a video game, and that's like squeezing the lemon really hard, right? So the more pleasurable the activity is, the harder the squeeze. Or we can do a very boring activity like sorting our mail or going through our mail or doing some kind of paperwork. Now, this is not a very pleasurable activity, so it's like a slight squeeze. Now, here's the issue. When I wake up in the morning and my dopamine circuitry is full of dopamine, even a slight squeeze will give us a fair amount of juice, right? When the lemon is full, I can squeeze a little bit, I get a decent amount of juice. The problem is that if I squeeze it really hard when I first wake up in the morning, all of the juice runs out. And then if I try to do a slight squeeze, nothing actually gets the juice out. I need to squeeze very, very, very hard. So this is what we tend to find if you look at, so I've worked with a lot of people who are, addicted to video games, and this is what we tend to find. If you play a video game in the first couple hours of the morning, the reward that you get from doing work that is important to you actually declines drastically.
El nombre del canal, que es Healthy Gamer GG, que es Gamer Sano GG, es porque el chabón literalmente se encargaba de tratar a gente que era adicta a los videojuegos. Porque por lo que acaba de decir, decía, tratamos mucha gente que tenía eso de videojuegos y lo dijo como mucha gente viciada a los videojuegos, como si fuera obvio, tipo por eso el canal se llama así.
From doing work that is important to you actually declines drastically. We essentially empty our dopamine through a video game, and then there's no dopamine left to give us a sense of reward for studying or going through the mail or organizing our bookshelf or whatever. The flip side is that if you wake up first thing in the morning and you start to do work, you're squeezing out, you get some degree of positive reinforcement, behavioral reinforcement, and pleasure. And then, even after you're done doing some amount of work, then you can squeeze the lemon, right? So we've squeezed out half of the juice by doing not very fun things. And then we can squeeze really hard by playing a video game at the end of the day, and we still have fun. So this is the problem with brain rot, is all of these activities that we do squeeze
O sea, que lo que aprendí es que para divertirme de verdad tengo que levantarme y jugar a los juegos.
all of the dopamine out, and then they reduce our ability to experience pleasure from other things. When you watch shorts for about 3 hours, nothing else feels engaging, right? It's not fun to read a book. It's not fun to hang out with other people. There's no amount of pleasure that we experience from work. And I see this all the time where people are like, oh, am I just supposed to like work for 8 hours a day and then commute and then work out and do laundry, and like this is what my life is for the next 30 years? And I empathize with that. We want life to be more than that. But oftentimes what I'm stunned by is when I work with people in my office who are talking about how terrible life is, I'll ask them one really simple thing. Hey, can I see your phone for a second? And I'll flip it open and I'll look at their average screen time usage, right? I'll tell them, hey, can we just like check out what your screen time usage is per day? And I'm shocked because it's usually about 4.5 hours at the minimum, up to about 6 hours a day, which is sort of the national average in the United States. And so it's not just that our life is like empty, it's that we are engaging with things, we are sort of eating so many calories without getting nutrition that it messes up the way that our brain circuitry works. So let's take another example, relationships and socialization. So once again, the internet offers.
Antes de seguir, hoy vi que Mark Zuckerberg anunció que va a meter ya en nada en los videos de Meta, o sea, Instagram y Facebook, que directamente se traduzcan los videos al instante. O sea, estoy al horno, si me miran eso a mí. Sí, yo también. Hay que dejarlo. Pero bueno, que se puedan traducir los videos al instante. Tipo, y lo hacen con tu voz. O sea, podemos ver este mismo video en español como si hablara el chabón. O sea, es como una inteligencia artificial que usa la misma voz del chabón en español. Es increíble. Nada, me estoy acordando porque imagínate ver esto en ese idioma. Sería clave.
Offers us an opportunity to scratch certain parts of our brain, but not really do the whole thing. And anytime you get a partial activation of the brain, this results in problems down the line. So there's simple things like I can socialize on the internet, right? So I'm going to talk to my friends, and I'm someone who socializes on the internet. I have friends that I've been gaming with for years that I've never met in real life. I consider them my real friends. I started playing StarCraft with someone when I was 15 years old, or maybe even 14. That the first time I met them was at my wedding. So I'm not one of these people who's like, oh my God, internet relationships are fake. They are real. They can be very positive in many ways. And they are incomplete. And they are a little bit closer to calories than nutrition. Because there are some things that you can't do over an internet relationship. You can never receive a hug. You can never have physical contact. And these kinds of things, when we talk about the circuitry of human relationships, these things are very beneficial for us, right? We already talked about oxytocin. Anytime I hug someone, I get a spurt of oxytocin. Reduces my stress, improves my mood, reduces my anxiety, reduces my inflammation. Like my whole body inflammation goes down with something like oxytocin. So what we see with all of these like internet relationships is number one. And then especially on the Brainrot side, we see things like parasocial relationships. And this is part of the reason why some of these platforms like Twitch and OnlyFans become so popular. Because what's starting to happen is people are figuring out how to scratch more of that itch. And the more of the itch that they scratch, the more addicted you will become. So let's use a simple example like OnlyFans. So it used to be that pornography would just activate your sensory receptors and sort of activate some of your...
¿Escucharon, loco? Eso va para ustedes. Oh, ¿me podrías reaccionar al tema de un amigo? No, gracias. Ahora voy a quedar como Gil. Perdón, amigo. Pasa que me lo preguntan todo el tiempo y no estoy como reaccionando ahora mismo a canciones.
dopaminergic circuitry, like that's it, right? So we're seeing these naked people doing things that are sexual. We feel somewhat aroused, and then maybe there's some amount of masturbation or orgasm associated with it, which is some amount of dopamine, and that's kind of how it was. But the issue was that with pornography, you couldn't have a relationship with this person, right? You were a consumer. They are filming something, right? It's a film that you're watching or whatever. And then someone invented OnlyFans. And with OnlyFans, now you can have interaction. You can say to them, good morning, and they can say back to you, good morning. You can even create some degree of a transactional relationship or some degree of reciprocity. You send them money, they make a special video just for you. And so if we look at what is this actually doing, it is starting to activate additional parts of our brain. The problem is when we start to do this activation, it's not actually like we're moving from Twinkies or candy bars to broccoli. We're actually just eating Twinkies for more parts of our brain. Now there is this fake level of social interaction because when you're getting a DM from an OnlyFans creator, chances are it's some 45 balding dude who's like been hired by the OnlyFans creator to make you feel special. It is highly unlikely that it's the OnlyFans creator themselves. And even if you do this kind of stuff, right? So even if you're directly interacting with them, I don't know that, I've never heard of a case of someone spending a ton of money on an OnlyFans creator and then actually forming a real relationship with them. But this is the way that people feel, right? They think, okay, like this is like, this person really does get me. This person has a relationship. This person cares about me a lot. And why do we feel that way? We feel that way because these parasocial platforms engage more circuits of our brain. And once again, the real problem with this stuff is that it decreases our drive to engage in real relationships. And I've even seen or heard and worked with people who have horror stories of ruining their real life relationship because of a relationship with an OnlyFans creator. So this is the core problem with why we're rotting our brains. People are figuring out how to artificially activate these various circuits. And the more circuits that they activate, the more we get pulled into it, right? Because remember, all of these circuits evolved to drive us towards survival. So when our brain gets this stuff, it's like, hey.
Ok, ya vimos bastante. Quiero ver si hay algo más especial. Bajé un toque los subtítulos. Es que me gusta verlo ahí enfrente de la cara del chabón. Quiero ver cuando decía lo de el gordo de 45 años, calvo, estaba diciendo los que responden, ¿no? No entendí eso. Pero creo que sí, que los que responden no son la chica del OnlyFans.
Like been hired by the OnlyFans creator to make you feel special. It is highly unlikely to do this activation. It's not actually like we're moving from Twinkies or candy bars to broccoli. We're actually just eating Twinkies for more. I've never heard of it's the OnlyFans creator themselves. And even if you do this kind of stuff, right? So even if you're directly interacting with them, I don't know that, I've never heard. Dude, who's when you're getting a DM of our brain. Now there is this fake level of social interaction because when you're getting a DM from an OnlyFans creator, chances are it's some 45 balding dude who's like been hired by.
Esto, claro, yo lo había leído y decía, lo más probable es que tengas 45 años de calvicie, pero creo que se refería al que... Claro,
the OnlyFans creator to make you feel special. It is...
Claro, el que te responde, tipo, no es la de OnlyFans, son chabones que contratan para que estén ahí constantemente farmeando plata de los followers. Bueno, vamos a ir viendo igual. Iba a correrlo. ¿De qué habla después? Consecuencias físicas. Sí, yo creo que pinta verlo. Además, siento que hay un montón de gente que igualmente no está comentando porque está literalmente prestando atención a esto. Porque hay que leer y no se puede hacer nada más porque habla muy rápido el chabón. Y que capaz ya se enganchó y quiere verlo. Así que vamos a verlo.
Online interaction. And specifically with social anxiety, the more online time you spend, the more some circuits of your brain start to atrophy, right? So we'll see things like circuits related to body language, tone, some of these like interpersonal communication skills start to weaken when all you're ever doing is DMing people or sitting in voice chats, right? There's no like there's no like understanding of like eye contact, for example. And so what I see is a lot of these people then try to go socialize. And since they don't have practice with eye contact, they don't know how to do eye contact properly. And since they don't know how to do eye contact properly, one of two things happens. Either they get called a creep because their eye contact is really intense and they don't look away often enough, or they feel that people feel like they're mentally checked out because there's not enough eye contact and they're always like kind of looking over here or looking over here and they never make eye contact with you. So these eye contact circuits require some degree of practice, and if they're out of practice, we end up feeling incredibly awkward. Then what happens? I try to go socialize. And since I've been on this diet of candy bars this whole time, when I socialize, people call me a creep or they call me awkward or I feel awkward. And then it's very hard for me to socialize again. So this is literally what's happening. As we're activating our circuits, we are sort of losing the capacity to engage normally. We're losing the capacity to engage in like romantic relationships, right? Because we're eating this internet diet of like this weird, toxic, whatever, like pink pill, red pill, whatever kind of stuff, right? We have all these ideas about relationships, but we're not spending a whole lot of time in relationships. We have all this dopaminergic crap that we're consuming that messes with our behavioral reinforcement and motivational circuitry, so we don't feel like doing anything. We have all of these problems with simple things like socialization and anxiety and all that kind of stuff. But that's not the end of it. So I was looking at a bunch of research, right, trying to figure out, okay, what is the cost of spending time on the internet or playing video games? And we'll just show you all a couple of papers. Like, this stuff is wild, okay? Right? So enhancement of allergic skin wheal response in patients with atopic eczema dermatitis syndrome by playing video games or by a frequently ringing mobile phone. So this is a study that looks at, like, literally how video games and a ringing mobile phone will make your allergic skin responses worse. So if you have an atopic disease like asthma, eczema, these things will get worse when you actually play video games. So physiologic responses to playing a video game. This is another paper that kind of looks, both of these papers look at cardiovascular things. So when we play video games, we'll do things like we'll see increases in heart rate, systolic and diastolic blood pressure, ventilation. So these are normally things that are associated with exercise. So when we exercise, we see all of these increases. The problem is that, like, when our physiology gets stressed in this way and we're not exercising, it actually causes damage. So we see this, like, this gets really wild. So it turns out that there's, this is a paper that looks at 4 cases of people who have thromboembolic events. So sometimes human beings have these things called blood clots. And sometimes the blood clot is in a place like your brain. And then you get...
Me da ganas de saltar toda esta parte porque siento ya redundante, pero creo que es lo más importante. Tipo, va a hablar físicamente de los problemas que puede causar. Y por lo que está hablando, creo que va a hablar de una serie. Gracias, Luis Omar, por el sub, amigo. Te mando un saludo muy grande.
Something called a stroke. And when you have a stroke, there is a part of your brain, there's a part of a blood vessel in your brain gets blocked off by a clot. And when a clot blocks off a blood vessel, all of the tissue downstream from the clot that gets fed by that blood vessel actually doesn't get blood anymore. And then that tissue dies. So this is normally a problem that we see in older people, right? So strokes and blood clots are things that we see in people who are like 60 plus, 70 plus, like not even 50-year-olds. Like the majority of people who have blood clots are like, you know, in retirement age. Now what's super scary is as we play these dopaminergic games and we're sitting on our ass all day, we have young people who are developing blood clots and things like strokes. And this is insane, right? This is not what the body is made for. And by the way, there's also a correlation between, the inappropriate activation of the cardiovascular system and the development of blood clots. Like all that stuff is related. Like everything in the human body is related. We also see problems with things like insulin resistance, like literally playing video games. I'll show you all the paper real quick, right? So associations of sedentary behavior and screen time with biomarkers of inflammation and insulin resistance. So leisure screen time was detrimentally associated with IL-6. This is an interleukin that activates our immune system and leads to things like autoimmune disease. Leptin, this is something that has to do with our feeling of hunger and satiety. Insulin, HOMA, we won't go over that, and there's all these other things, but basically, like, these are all indicators of our energy metabolism, our feeling of feeling full, feeling hungry, inflammation, and insulin resistance. And insulin resistance leads to things like diabetes. Forget about forming bonds, forget about dopamine. There are very real health effects from engaging with this brain rotting content. And so the question is, like, what do we do about this, right? How do we stop? How do we break this cycle? And this is the real problem, is like, this is the reason it's so important, is because as we consume this weird content, right? This weird, like, AI generated, like, bot farm, rage bait inducing crap, the problem is that it destroys our motivation to actually, like, build our lives. Because what happens is they offer us such a cheap and easy way to get mentally satisfied. The problem is they literally, like, not literally, I guess. I think I can say literally, right? Because it induces inflammation. It induces thromboembolic events. It induces insulin resistance. All of these things are messing us up and then detract from our ability to actually improve our lives. And that's the real problem. So what do we do about that? So the short answer is, I don't know. Right? So this stuff is so new that I don't have a very simple, like, okay, just do this, 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 and this. But here's what I would kind of say. Here's when I work with people, this is kind of what I focus on. The first thing is that understand that there is a difference between calories and nutrition, and take a look at your life and start to ask yourself, what am I really getting from this? What direction is this stuff moving me in? Now, I know that everyone sort of says like, oh yeah, like obviously I should play less video games. Obviously I should spend less time on my screen, but I just don't do that. And then the question becomes why? Because when I work with people, it's not like there's a generic answer. This is where like the reason I love doing individual work is because people have individual solutions. And so I'd really start with sort of thinking a little bit about, what do you get from doing this? And don't say I don't get anything, it's a waste. That's incorrect. I wrote a book about like parenting kids with video game addiction. And one of the key things that I sort of found when it comes to addiction is you have to understand what is driving the addiction. Why are we engaging this behavior? What am I really getting out of this? And then the real way to get off of this brain rot is to really think about, okay, what am I getting out of this? And how can I get this outside of the brain rot content consuming OnlyFans video game kind of world, right? How can I get this outside of that? And here's what I tend to find when I work with people is that when you start to work on getting it outside from whatever the brain rot content is, it actually reduces your dependence on the brain rot. A simple way to put it is if I eat a bowl of broccoli, my desire for a candy bar will actually decrease. Broccoli dependence on the brain rot. A simple content is it actually reduces outside from whatever the brain rot content is. It actually reduces your dependence to work with people. Is that when you start to work on getting it outside from whatever the brain rot content is, it actually reduces your dependence on the brain rot. A simple way to put it is if I eat a bowl of broccoli, my desire for a candy bar will actually decrease, right? So this is what's really cool is we can use the same principle of candy bar if I eat a candy bar, I don't want to eat broccoli. The opposite is also true. If I start to eat broccoli, I don't feel like having a candy bar. If I'm dehydrated and I drink water, my desire for soda will naturally go down, okay? So this is where what we tend to work on here at Healthy Gamer is building a life that is worth living. So take one or two things, start very, very small, take one or two things and really think about, okay, what am I getting from this kind of thing? Is it social interaction? Is it a sense of joy? Is it a sense of accomplishment? What is it? And try to do those things as early in the day as possible. It can be something as simple as food, right? So even if I'm like spending 3 hours on the internet and then I'm starving and then I order a pizza or like microwave something, it can be something as simple as eating something. So steam some broccoli and eat it. Try to create whatever you can that sort of gets you to satisfy some nutritional need in yourself. That's the first thing. Second thing we really want to focus on is inflammation. And the third thing we want to focus on is sleep. So anytime I'm working with someone, what I tend to find is that there's a very efficient path of like reducing their inflammatory burden. So I know that. So the second thing that we're going to focus on is inflammation. Now this sounds kind of weird, right? Because what does inflammation have to do with this? So all of these activities, not all, but the majority of these activities will increase our inflammatory burden. Now the problem is that inflammation causes all kinds of downstream effects that make it really hard for us to stop the brain rot activities. So inflammation has been associated with depression. Inflammation is common in things like anxiety. Inflammation also makes it hard for us to sleep. So I see this cycle when I work with people where like they have a high inflammatory burden. It's hard for them to sleep. So when they wake up in the morning, their frontal lobes and their willpower is actually exhausted. A crappy night of sleep means that you have very little willpower the next day, which then makes it very hard to resist all of this brain rotting activity. So what I tend to do, and then it becomes like an impossible cycle, right? So if I can't sleep, then I have no willpower. If I have no willpower, I can't resist the activity. If I can't resist the activity, I can't sleep, right? Because then I stay awake all night. I stay awake way too late, spending time on the internet or whatever. So how do you break the cycle? It's really interesting, but oftentimes you have to kind of work tangentially. So try to reduce your inflammatory burden as much as possible. So that means a couple servings of fresh fruits and vegetables a day. There are some supplements and things like that have been shown to use inflammatory burdens. Strongly recommend that y'all talk to your doctors about things like that. But even things like fish oil and omega-3 and stuff like that has been shown to reduce inflammation, can be healthy for your heart. So do whatever you can to reduce your inflammation. Another thing that's really good at reducing inflammation is actually exercise. And you can even do something like go for a walk for like 30 minutes. The cool thing about going for a walk is it sort of activates your cardiovascular system, creates an energy expenditure, causes you to do things like sweat. And then the cool thing about exercise is as you exercise, you will start to crave healthier foods. So your desire for drinking water will actually increase the more that you exercise. So anti-inflammatory diet and exercise, I'd say spend 1 hour a day. That's it, right? So we're going to do some activity at the beginning that we find nutritious, and then we're going to exercise for 30 minutes and cook yourself some kind of healthy meal. And I know it sounds like, but how does that tackle the brain rot? This is the key thing that I want y'all to understand. You need to leverage your physiology, right? You need to get your physiology working for you instead of working against you. And when we have a brain rot lifestyle, when we have a sedentary lifestyle, our cravings for water actually decrease. Our desire for soda can increase because we have insulin resistance. So we need more sugar to overcome that insulin resistance. So a lot of things can start to turn around. The last thing that I would strongly recommend if you're stuck in this brain rot lifestyle is a decent night's sleep. So I recommend things like yoga nidra about 1 hour before you go to bed. You can take things like melatonin and stuff. That's definitely something to talk to your doctor about. But this is the kind of thing where you can take things like melatonin and stuff. That's definitely something to talk to your doctor about. But this is the kind of thing where getting a good night's sleep is about how you spend your day. We have a whole video about that hopefully will help y'all out quite a bit. And this is sort of how we break free from the cycle. So it's kind of scary, but the stuff that rots our brain is actually incredibly addictive. And the reason that it's incredibly addictive is because people have figured out how to hyperactivate certain circuits of our brain that in the past helped us to survive, which means that since these circuits were survival oriented, anytime we activate them, we have a very strong behavioral reinforcement to engage with it again. The biggest problem with activating these circuits isn't even the direct damage that they do. It's actually that it destroys our motivation to satisfy those circuits in the way that they're supposed to be satisfied, in a way that is way healthier. And so that reduces our motivation to actually put our lives together. So I hope that this video has been helpful for y'all. I know it's incredibly challenging. And please let us know, for what we said today, what works, what doesn't work, what are the additional challenges that y'all run into, and let us know, because this is not the last video that we're going to make on brain rot. Hey y'all, if you've watched our content for a while, you're probably pretty familiar with our core concept. And that's why I'm excited about YouTube memberships. Memberships allows us to be driven.
Promo memberships. Bueno, joya. Buen video, largo. Es un video duro de ver en directo. Tipo, es un video de media hora de un chabón hablando en inglés con subtítulos, en el que no solamente tenemos que estar leyendo, sino que no puedo hablar mucho porque me distraigo. Pero en un momento casi lo saco y dije, no, lo voy a ver porque quiero justamente como romper esa barrera, ¿entendés? Tipo, quiero hacer esto aunque sea durísimo y ahora después de ver un video en español siento que, no sé, va a ser mucho más digerible y sencillo. Yo sí escuché lo que es saber inglés, lo que es saber el puto inglés. No, yo estaba leyendo. Si me pongo, si no le presto atención a los subtítulos, es como que me puedo poner a escuchar y solamente le entiendo una gran parte. Pero poner que el 65, el 70% le entendería. Una gran parte no. Pero es como que cuando tengo los subtítulos adelante no puedo evitar leerlo. Tipo, tengo que sacarlos directamente. El flaco hablaba muy bien aparte. Sí, escapo. Quiero ver una pequeña parte, si me permiten, si me disculpan, que es cuando adelanté y retrasé, que no sé si me perdí una parte en el medio. Es súper rápido igual. Si me perdí una parte fue 1 minuto. Que es cuando pasé de hablar de OnlyFans a lo normal, digamos.
An OnlyFans creator. So this is the core problem with why we're rotting our brains. People are figuring out how to artificially activate these various circuits. And the more circuits that they activate, the more we get pulled into it, right? Because remember, all of these circuits evolved to drive us towards survival. So when our brain
es increíble porque le di justo donde quería verlo, boludo.
Gets this stuff, it's like, hey, this is good. This is great. We like this. Candy bars are awesome. We're getting a bunch of calories, and this increases our survival. The problem is that it costs us so much. The first thing that it costs us is it reduces our motivation. It tanks our motivation to actually build the real thing. And I've worked with Good Morning. You can even create some degree of a transactional relationship or some degree of you. And so if we look at what is this actually doing, it is starting to activate additional parts of our brain. The problem is when we start to do this activation, it's not actually like we're moving from these, because when you're getting a DM from the OnlyFans themselves. And, I've never heard of a case
Deme un
of
segundito,
someone spending a ton of money on an OnlyFans creator and then actually forming a real relationship. This person really does get me. This person has a relationship. This person cares about me a lot. And why do we feel that way? We feel that way because these parasocial platforms engage more circuits of our brain. And once again, the real problem with this stuff is that it decreases our drive to engage in real relationships.
Ok, Flama. Entendido. Bueno, gran video, boludo. Gran video, me siento satisfecho. La verdad, aprendí bastante, amigos. O sea, no sé ustedes, pero yo me quedo con bastantes cosas. Quizá un poco son asustantes, pero lo de que todo esto está empezando a crear una epidemia casi de ACVs, digamos, de derrames cerebrales más juveniles, interesante. A escuchar. No me voy a poner loco, tipo ahí paranoico. Pero bueno, es información que es interesante saber. También, bueno, todo lo que habla de la sociabilización, yo no entendí nada. ¿No entendiste, amigo? Es buena data, pero en principio tenés que dejar de consumir las redes. Lo más importante que dijo al final, dice que no sabe cómo muy bien porque es muy nuevo esto, del contenido basura y vacío, que es básicamente un hack, tipo todo lo que estamos viendo, Reels, Instagram, TikTok, es un hack a tu cerebro para darle una recompensa rápida por algo que en realidad le costaría más tiempo. Aunque yo tengo mis dudas, tipo, ¿por qué se genera esa recompensa? Es como, en cierta parte, por información que recibimos. ¿Y no les ha pasado a ustedes más de una vez que ven algún que otro TikTok y no solamente se informan como si fueran noticias, sino que también se motivan por algo? Tipo, les aparece algo que les interesa, de un juego que les gusta, se ponen a jugar ese juego y les cambia la vida, ¿entendés? O sea, es información también, no está tan mal, no es todo vacío. Entiendo que él se la pasa hablando del Skibidi Toilet y esto, ¿entendés? Entonces quizás se refiere a ese contenido en particular, todo el contenido basura. Pero si vos las redes las usás de una forma inteligente para que te salte el contenido que te importa, este mismo contenido podría haber visto un clip de 1 minuto en TikTok. Entiendo que es mejor ver el video entero de 30 minutos y eso ya lo entendí, que es mejor ver un contenido largo y contundente. O sea, está bueno tener todo el contexto en vez de esto que tenemos ahora de ver 30 segundos, 30 segundos, 30 segundos, 30 segundos, porque no terminamos de entrar en nada. Pero bueno, lo piola del chabón es que al final tiró que, aunque no sabe porque esto es muy nuevo, dice que algo que hace el cerebro es que cuando vos dejás de ver TikTok y empezás a buscar una fuente que te dé dopamina de otra forma, tu cerebro lentamente deja de querer ver el TikTok, ¿entendés? O sea, hay que encontrar una fuente que supla eso y que esté bien construida, tipo algo que de verdad te guste. O sea, que de verdad te guste y que te dé dopamina. No te va a dar tanta como los TikToks o como los juegos, pero que te dé un poco de dopamina. Dejas de hacer esto y te pones a hacer lo otro y lentamente tu cerebro se acostumbra y le agrada hacer eso y ya después cuando veas TikTok no te gusta. De hecho, es lo que pasa mucho. Yo cada vez que dejo de ver TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, lo que sea, es como que al principio, literalmente, cuando digo, ok, basta, 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 es como que tengo una adicción, amigo, de querer abrir el celu y abrir Instagram de vuelta y Twitter y cerrarlo y verlo, ¿entendés? Y mientras más tiempo pasa, más te desconectás. Y si estás un día sin verlo, ya el otro día, amigo, es como que no tenés ganas de abrirlo, tipo te aburre. Y después lo abrís un poquito, te sigue aburriendo, ves un par de cosas, tiki, 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 te envicias y ahí caes de vuelta. Entonces, mientras más lo olvides, menos ganas te da. Es algo que pasa en bastantes ámbitos. Bueno, piola, hay que hacer ejercicio, evitar la inflamación, eso ya se sabe. Pero hay que dejar de recibir tanta información y dejar de jugar tanto con la dopamina, parece, porque se viene el ACV. Se viene el ACV, la inflamación y, bueno, otras cosas que charló en este momento que estaban interesantes. Cardiovasculares. Estoy viendo la parte esa de los ataques. ¿Qué era lo segundo que había dicho? Había dos datos muy fuertes. Sistema inmunológico, inflamación y resistencia a la insulina. Hay que hacer ejercicio, hay que ver menos pantallas. Yo tengo unos anteojos de bloqueadores de luz azul. Si quieren me los pongo como clics y me pongo en modo raro. Y streameo con lentes naranjas como para no ver pantallas. A ver, quieren ver cómo me queda. Voy a dejar esto de paso, que es mi cena. Ya vengo, gente. Y dejar de consumir basura, loco. Ey, dejen de consumir basura en cualquier red social. Todos los fandoms están constituidos por niños. Y ahora les voy a explicar por qué. Hoy los niños son temas recurrentes. Los niños tienen la culpa. No, es que los chicos son mucho más consumistas, claramente, de las redes y de cualquier contenido que esté vacío. Calculo que no tienen tanto... No sé exactamente porque no soy un experto, pero no tienen tanto problema en perder su tiempo. Quieren divertirse simplemente. Quieren dopamina fácil, quieren divertirse, no quieren obligaciones. También yo creo que tiene que ver con el hecho de que cuando sos chico vas al colegio, cumplís tus objetivos, tipo, vas 8 horas al colegio, que es un trabajo forzoso realmente. O sea, no un trabajo forzoso, pero digo, es un momento de concentración absoluta y de reglas en las que no puedes hacer nada que te guste. O sea, como privado de dopamina casi. También estás con tus compañeros, todo. Pero bueno, después volvés y Y es como que saben, disfrutan más de su tiempo y bueno, lo hacen puro de ocio. Pero consumen mucho contenido vacío y bueno, después ya a medida que vas creciendo, vas interesándote más en otras cosas y aprendiendo. Pero bueno, amigos, no hay que perder el tiempo, no hay que quemarse. Y obviamente cualquier creador va a apuntar a tener ese tiempo, porque el tiempo de un nene de 8 años y el de un señor de 40 paga lo mismo. O sea, para hacer plata, no. El público de los niños es el más fácil, ¿entendés? Porque tienen más tiempo para gastar, son más influenciables y te van a ver más tiempo, aunque no le estés aportando nada, aunque estén viendo 45 horas de nada, amigo, de una pantalla verde. Y, y también lo que pasa mucho que había escuchado es que generalmente cuando la gente es más joven, se los conté ayer, no antes de ayer, cuando la gente es más joven, generalmente comparten casi todos los mismos gustos. O sea, todos los chicos jóvenes juegan o a Minecraft o al juego que esté de moda, etcétera. A medida que van creciendo, se van distribuyendo en diferentes nichos. Pero entonces, si sos es mejor apuntar a un público que sea de esa edad porque tenés más público para consumir, para que te consuma, ¿entendés? Si apuntas a público grande, solamente vas a apuntar a un nicho. Pero bueno, nada de eso, amigos. Ojo, tengo 4 hijos, perdón si solo te puedo ver una hora. ¿Cómo? Pero nada de eso, amigos. No pierdan su tiempo, loco. Es lo más preciado que tienen y que tenemos. Así que hay que usarlo sabiamente. Yo no quiero hacerles perder su tiempo. A pesar de que no siempre me salga, ¿no? O sea, muchas veces prendemos IRL charlando y no llegamos a ninguna conclusión. Y quizá les hago perder su tiempo, pero no quiero que sea mi intención. Y ojo, quizá tarde o temprano vuelva a ser una basura que juega Minecraft y Fortnite todo el tiempo. En ese momento no les... No sé. Es medio hipócrita. Sería medio hipócrita de mi parte. Pasa que por eso es que dejé de jugar, porque no me da ganas de jugar y más o menos yo no consumo ese contenido, yo no consumo contenido gamer, entonces dejé de hacerlo. Y bueno, mucha gente me dice, pero el trabajo es trabajo, loco, ponete a jugar. Además nosotros queremos verte jugar, ¿qué me importa? O sea, hay gente que dice, me chupa huevo, amigo, yo quiero verte jugar, yo juego todo el día, quiero verte jugar, punto. Y a veces, ojo, me pongo a jugar y me vicia un poco, pero es como que desde afuera después lo veo con aburrimiento. Pero nada, veremos si se consigue hacer el futuro del contenido. Si lo que quieras, Oscu, hago lo que yo quiero. Bueno, miren, estos son mis... Pero puedes despegarte en esto, Oscu. ¿Cómo? ¿A qué te referís? Pero a las horas más moderado, creo. Y digo eso, pero con las canciones. ¿Cuál perder el tiempo? Si yo ni siquiera verte, si yo no quisiera verte, no te vería. Y chamba es chamba. No, ya sé, o sea, yo estoy tratando de ser, tipo, de buscar mis imperfecciones y mejorarlas. Pero sí, realmente considero que trato de no hacerles perder el tiempo dentro de todo. Igual lo que sí, no, o sea... Sí, pero puede ser manipulado. O sea, justamente la manipulación es que no te des cuenta, ¿entendés? O sea, yo porque te lo estoy diciendo muy directamente, pero cualquier persona que se la pasa haciendo un contenido basura que no te lleva a ningún lado y que no te enseña absolutamente nada, lo más probable es que no te diga lo basura que es, sino que lo haga y vos lo consumís y listo, te libera dopamina. Pero bueno, justamente de eso trata el video de 30 minutos que acabamos de ver. De que no es una cuestión de que vos quieras o no, es una cuestión de que tu cerebro es engañado para eso, ¿entendés? O sea, a tu cerebro le libera dopamina, es un bug, es un hack que hace que vos te sientas satisfecho viéndolo, aunque no te aporte nada bueno. Entonces vos tenés que salir de ahí. No es, si yo no quisiera, no te veo, obvio, pero vos me entendés. Oh.